Good day to be here. So excited. If you're new here, thanks for being here. I would love to meet you if I haven't met you already. And one way you can help me know that you're here is in the seat in front of you, there's a card that says Connect on it. So if you'd fill that out, there's a box in the back that you can drop that in, and we would love to know that you're here and get to know you better. So let me ask you a question. Who knows, let me ask it this way, who doesn't know what this is? If you don't know what this is, raise your hand. There's no shame here. Just, if you don't know, raise your hand. Come on, I need a volunteer. Surely somebody in this room. Okay, Jude, my man, come up here. All right, so introduce yourself, Jude.
My name is Jude.
Okay, this is Jude, everyone. All right, good job. All right, turn around, face the crowd here. So, you don't know what this is?
No.
Okay, what do you think it is?
A game?
Okay, it's a game. How do you think you play it?
Move pegs?
Okay, move pegs how?
I don't know.
Okay, yeah, here's where the part you don't know, right? So you don't know what this is for. How do you think you could find out what it's for?
Look it up online, read instructions.
Yeah, look it up online. How else? Suppose your internet was down. How else could you find out?
Ask somebody?
Ask somebody. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so what if everybody you asked, and what if when you looked online, you couldn't find the answer? But on the back of this, it said, this was made by John Jones. What do you think you could do then?
Look up John Jones.
And then do what?
And then, if he's still alive, ask him.
Ask him, right? Why would you ask him?
To know how to play the game.
Yeah, but why would he know?
Because he made it.
Because he made it. Very good. All right, you guys give Jude a hand here. Good job, Jude. Okay, so when I was like in middle school, we lived in Washington State, and my grandfather specifically, made me one of these. Okay, so this was in the 70s. This is how old this thing is, all right? Not this one, but this game, all right? But since it was homemade, it did have this wooden triangle, but instead of these fancy plastic pegs, it had nails in there, okay? So he made it, and he mailed it to me with no instructions. Okay, so I got this thing in the mail and thought, what is this? And what am I supposed to do with it? Why did he send it to me? So I wrote him a letter because it was the 70s, right? That was the only way you could get time. So I wrote him a letter and I said, hey, I asked him two questions. What is this and what is it for? Now, evidently, all of you know what it is except Jude, and Jude knew somehow it was a game. So yeah, this is a game, and Jude, I will tell you later how you play this game, okay? So I guess all y'all go to Cracker Barrel, which is a great place to go, okay? So I spent days, if not weeks, trying to figure out what in the world was this thing that my grandfather sent me, and why? Why did he send it to me? What was the purpose of it? What was I supposed to do? Today, we are wrapping up our series on spiritual habits. And today, we're going to be talking about serving. And so we're going to look at a passage that does talk about serving. It's John 13, if you want to go ahead and get turned there. But I want to look at this particular passage because it really talks more about who we are and why we were made. Not necessarily what we do. What we do is serve. But it talks about who we are and what were we made for? Okay, that's what this passage is really about. So who am I and why am I here? Those two questions have been around probably since man has walked the faces of this earth. Those two questions transcend time, they transcend cultures, religions, you name it. Every person that's ever walked the earth has wondered those two questions. Who am I? Right? Who am I really, and why am I here? What's my purpose? Why am I on this ball of dirt? And so those two things are universal questions. And here's what we need to know. If we're going to talk about serving, if you're going to be free to serve, then you need to know the answer to those two things. You need to know who you are, which is your identity, and why you are here, which is your purpose. Who you are and why you are here. So your identity and purpose. Those things have to be settled in your mind before you can really, truly serve. Yeah, you can serve out of guilt or obligation or whatever, but to be free to serve, you need to know those two things. Now, I'll tell you this also. If you figure those two things out, your life will take on a whole different trajectory. Okay, your life will be different if you can figure those two things out. And lots of people spend a lot of time trying to figure those two things out, and they stub their toe on a lot of different things. Okay, so we're going to try and get to the root of that this morning. in relation to serving, all right? So John chapter 13, verse 1, here's what John wrote. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave the world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now that word to the end there is an interesting word. It's teleos in the original language, and it means the principal aim or purpose. Okay, the principal aim or purpose. And so everything God does is motivated by love, because that's who he is, right? Later, or actually earlier in his gospel, John would actually say that. God is love. He doesn't just love, he is love. So when John says that Jesus loved his disciples to the end, you could read that as Jesus loved his disciples because that was his purpose. That's who he was. That's why he was here, to love them. It's who he is. So he didn't come to be an earthly king, right? He could have done that, but he came as a servant. And being a servant was part of Jesus' identity. It's who he was as well. So he came to love his people, and he came to be a servant, to serve others. And I would tell you that that is our identity as well. We're to love and to serve others. That is, in simplest terms, that is our identity, and it is our purpose. Look at Genesis 2:15 with me. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it. Now, we need to learn about that word work it too. In the original language, in the Hebrew, it's abad, and it means to serve. Okay? So you could read that passage as, the Lord God put man in the Garden of Eden to serve. So from the beginning of time, we were meant to serve. That is our purpose. That's why we were created, was to serve. God put man in the garden to serve, okay? And when we serve, we're connecting to that ancient, right, thousands and thousands of years ago, that ancient and deep purpose. We're identifying with why we were made and what we were made for. It's our identity and our purpose. That's what we identify with when we serve. All right, let's continue in John. This is verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So Jesus knew exactly who he was, right? He was the Son of God. That's why he was returning to the Father. All things have been put under his power. He knew that as well, right? That's his identity. That's why Jesus could freely and resolutely rebuke anyone who tried to put him in an earthly position of power, tried to make him king, right? He could say, that's not me. That's not my purpose. That's not my identity. That's not why I'm here. Because he knew his identity and his purpose. I mean, you could start with when Jesus was tempted in the desert by Satan, right? 3 times Satan tried to get Jesus to take a position of power, which Satan knew would result in Jesus being elevated as an earthly king in Israel. And 3 times Jesus said, nope. That's not who I am. That's not why I've come. And so starting with Satan and his whole 3 years of ministry there as well. The nation of Israel, the people that followed him, were constantly trying to elevate him. Hey, when are you going to take power? When are you going to kick the Romans out of here? When are you going to become our king? And he did become their king, and your king and my king, but not in the way that they suspected, right? He did it not by taking a position of power, but by serving. That's how he became king, by serving, not in a position of power, all right? John 13 again, verses 4 through 5. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Jesus took this position of humility, right? Not only by stepping out of heaven and becoming a man, but here with his disciples, he took this ultimate position of humility by stooping low to wash his disciples' feet. In that culture, there was no lower menial job than to wash people's feet. It's why it was reserved for servants, right? It was a job that was so menial, so low, and really probably so disgusting, right? We've talked about this whole washing feet thing back in that day, that in the Roman Empire, only slaves could do it. And even in some Roman cities, the cities passed laws that said, that is so disgusting, you can't make a slave do it. You're just going to have to wash your own feet, okay? So it was a low position. And he lowered himself to do that on that night of the last Passover. Jesus knew who he was, right? All power, all things have been placed under his authority. Yet he lowers himself in a position of humility to wash his disciples' feet. He gets up from the meal, right? He takes off his outer garment and puts on the role of a servant. John tells us that he took off his outer clothing. That would have been kind of a robe-like thing. It may have even been a rabbinical robe, which would have identified him as a rabbi or teacher based on that robe that he wore. But he took those things off and he put them aside. Why do you think he took it off? Any guesses? This is where you participate. Any guesses? Why did he take it off? Be brave. Say it. Didn't want to get it dirty. What else? Use it as a rag? Okay, it's something really, really practical. It was in the way, right? If you're going to squat down and bend down and probably get on your hands and knees to wash people's feet, if you've got this big robe on, it's probably going to get in the way. Maybe he wanted to keep it clean. Maybe it was a really nice robe, right? But it was in the way, okay? He took off something that was in the way of him serving others. It's a good lesson for us today. That's not the primary point, though, okay? Jesus is not being just an example here, although he is setting an example. It's his purpose to serve. It's why he came. Let's see. Jesus knows that by serving his disciples, they'll find their purpose as well. Okay, by demonstrating, hey, I came to serve, he's not just saying it to servants, he's demonstrating it. You know, you probably know people, right, who say one thing, I believe this, but their actions don't really back up what they believe, okay? You can tell what people really believe by what they do. Okay, what they say is probably good, but watch what they do. That's how you know. That's what Jesus was doing here. He said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And so he shows them in the most lowest way possible. To serve is to demonstrate humility, especially in this example. You had to have true humility to wash people's feet. To serve is to demonstrate humility. So true humility, how do we get there? That comes from being in agreement with God about who he says you are. Okay? Humility comes from being in agreement with who God says you are. Not who you think you are, not who others say you are, but who God says you are. That is how you get to true humility. When you get to that point, then you become free to serve. You can lower yourself to become a servant to others because you're not hung up on what other people think, right? You don't owe anybody anything, and nobody owes you anything either, right? It's what you were created to do. You're fulfilling your purpose. Now, unfortunately, a lot of us struggle with that prospect of humility. And it's not because we don't want to. I mean, I'm going to tell you a little bit later about that, why we struggle with it. But we live in this land of insecurity sometimes. Okay? Not always. Maybe you camp out there sometimes, but we all visit it sometimes. And the land of insecurity has some landmarks. How do you know if you're operating out of insecurity? Well, it looks like people-pleasing and needing and manipulating. Those are all kind of landmarks in the land of insecurity. If you see those landmarks in your life, you might need to check yourself and say, am I operating out of insecurity? Because those things are kind of synonymous with that. See, you can be serving out of a place of insecurity and doing great things, and yet you're still needing and manipulating and people-pleasing. Let me ask you this. What do you think the opposite of insecurity is? It's actually like the evil twin of insecurity. Anyone? Fear, yeah. Pride, okay. So another word for pride would be arrogance. Yeah, arrogance is the other side of the coin from insecurity. And it's the same deal, right? When you serve out of arrogance, you could be doing great things, but arrogance has some traits too. It looks like proving and using and controlling. Okay, if you're serving out of arrogance, you feel like you have to prove yourself to others, right? Because you think that you're somewhere, and so you need to prove that to other people, right? Or you use other people to accomplish those things that will help elevate you. Or you're just plain old controlling, okay? I am a reformed, actually I'm a reforming, if I'm honest, control freak, okay? I battle that constantly, and it is born out of pride or arrogance sometimes, and it's taken me a long time to figure that out. That's part of that whole, hey, who are you really? What's your real identity, okay? And that was born out of me thinking my identity was what I did, right? And we've got to learn that it's not what we do, it's who we are. And it's really who God says we are. That's our identity. See, you can serve others out of insecurity. You can serve them out of arrogance. You can run around serving Christ. You can run around serving this church, hoping that God will accept you, hoping that you're earning points with God, right? That's insecurity. That you think you can earn God's favor, thinking that you're beyond redemption by the work that was done on the cross. You don't have to earn anything if you're a follower of Jesus. That's been taken care of. Your service has nothing to do with your standing because of what's been done on the cross. It's already been taken care of, right? That's why you have to agree with who God says you are. You can do the same thing out of arrogance. You can run around, you can serve others, you can serve the church, you can do great things thinking that you're earning God's approval. And that's arrogance because you think that the God who created everything out of nothing needs your help. He doesn't. He allows us to join him in his work. And so both of those things, you're doing great things, but they look like insecurity and they look like arrogance. We want to get to that place of humility where we're free to serve. We're serving because we don't feel like anybody owes us anything and we don't owe anybody else anything. We're free to be who God has created us to be. Here's a good saying. Being free to serve means that you have to recognize again and agree with who God says you are. And there's a pastor out of New York City, Tim Keller, who says it this way. He says that you are more wicked than you ever dared believe, right? But you're more loved than you could ever dare hope for. And that's true. It's both sides, right? Nobody likes to admit they're wicked. But there are days when I know that I'm wicked. I know in my thought life, I know things that come out of my mouth, right? The standard's not, well, I'm better than my neighbor. The standard is God, okay? Compared to him in his holiness, in our flesh, apart from Christ, we are wicked. And so we've got to understand that, yeah, I'm that, but I'm also that. I'm also more loved than I could ever dare hope for because of what's been done on the cross. And so it's this dichotomy that's kind of fighting each other there. Understanding that you're more loved, right, than you ever dare hoped, and because of that, Jesus chose to serve you by going through the cross, that'll kill your insecurity. Okay? You're more loved than you could ever dare hope. And because of that, Jesus went to the cross for you. Understanding that you're more wicked than you could ever imagine, right? And yet, in spite of that, Jesus served you by going to the cross. That will cure your arrogance. Okay? Knowing that truth of who I am allows you to be free to serve out of that place of humility. Now, here's the good news about insecurity and arrogance. We inherited that. We inherited it from our relatives, from Adam and Eve. Think back all the way in Genesis, right? In the Garden of Eden, okay? There's Adam and Eve in the garden, made in the image of God. No one's ever been more truly in the image of God than those two, right? And yet, they didn't believe what God said about them. The serpent, Satan, tempted them by saying, you're not like God. If you eat that fruit, then you'll be like God. And so they did. And then what happened, right? They were in the garden, which was a place they should have been safe, right? They were doing what they were created to do. They were created to what? Serve. That's why God placed them in the garden. And then Satan comes along, and now they're not in agreement with what God says they are. And so suddenly now they're fearful, and they're hiding. And then Adam, he even gets to the point where he's manipulating. And, when God shows up and says, hey, what happened? Adam says, the woman that you, God, put in the garden made me eat the fruit. It's not my fault. It's your fault because you put her in here with me. So they went from a place of being humble servants in the garden to being insecure and manipulating, right? So we inherited it from them. We come by it honestly. Here's the good news, though. We're all in one place or the other at any given time, okay? I think there's a picture. Think of it as like kind of like a balance beam. If you're walking down, yeah, there it is, okay? Humility's the middle of the road. You're walking there. But there's a tendency to fall off to one side or the other, okay? I might be humble this week, but something's happened. Next week, I find myself falling in the realm of arrogance. I might correct myself, and then the next week, I fall over into insecurity. And so it's this constant tension that we're trying to face there, that we would walk in humility. Now, both of these things, insecurity and arrogance, they're both issues of identity because we don't agree with what God says about us. We don't agree we are who God says we are. And so we get either insecure or we get arrogant. One's an underinflated view of who you are. The other's an overinflated view of who you are. And they're both driven by what you do. Okay, you think that what I do is going to impact either one of those things. They're both linked to the idea of humility, of coming to agreement with what God says about you. Let's pick up our story again, verses 6 and 7. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." Jesus demonstrated humility to his followers when he stepped out of heaven and humbled himself to be one of us, to be among us, right? To be a servant. It's what he lived for. It was truly his identity, that he was a servant. Jesus is saying, this is what life is all about. This is what I live for, right? And this is what you should be about, and this is what you should live for. It's why he demonstrated it to his disciples. Let's look at verses 7 and 8. Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." So how do we get to this place of being free to serve, this place of humility, okay? It's not when we serve out of guilt or obligation or expectation or our desires to please others. It's when we're free to serve out of humility, right? And the way we get there is, just like we see in this example, we let Jesus serve us, okay? You have to be served before you can be a servant. See, you let Jesus serve you by acknowledging who you really are, right? And acknowledging his rightful place in your life, that he is Lord and Savior and Master, and he deserves to sit on the throne of your life, not you. That's allowing him to serve you. You let him serve you by admitting and confessing your sin and admitting that you need a Savior, right? That's the gospel, that your sin separated you from God, and Jesus stepped out of heaven to wash you and make you clean, that you might be presented holy and righteous before God because of what's been done on the cross. That's how you let Jesus serve you, by recognizing and leaning into and confessing those things. Jesus knew that unless Peter let him wash his feet, Peter would never get to that point of humility. Right? Peter would never be able to serve, which is what he was created for. See, if Jesus had let Peter stop him there, Peter would have looked back on this night and always had this memory of, that was the night Jesus, Son of Man, Son of God, stepped out of heaven, born again, raised from the dead. He tried to wash my feet. And I said, no. You're too powerful. You're the man, Jesus. There's no way I'm going to let you do that. And he would have missed that demonstration, right? He would have missed following Jesus and doing as Jesus did. And if that's how it would have played out, Peter's life and ministry would have been impacted by that. Peter never would have been able to be in a position of humility again because he would have thought back and remembered, oh yeah, Jesus was too powerful to do that. And if Jesus is too powerful to do that, then, I'm like his second in command. So that's me too. So I don't have to serve people as well. And so Jesus knew Peter had to be served. He had to wash Peter's feet for Peter to get to this position of humility. When Jesus washed their feet, that was the most demonstrative way he could have demonstrated serving in that culture. To us, foot washing is just this weird thing because we wear shoes and have paved streets and everything. But, back then, dirt roads, some cobblestone roads, but mostly dirt roads, wearing sandals, feet are dirty all the time. So, again, just a menial thing. And yet he stooped low. He gave the ultimate example at that time of what being a servant looks like. And then just a few short hours, he would go to the cross and he would truly demonstrate why he came as a servant to all, right? That he would make a way back to the Father for us. So what Jesus did was truly an act of service, that we might discover our original purpose, that we might be like Adam. We might go back to the garden and do what we were created to do, which is to serve freely and without guilt, without obligation, that we would serve out of knowing who we are. Again, that we were at that point of, I don't owe anybody anything, and nobody owes me anything. I serve because it's part of my purpose. It's why I was created, right? It's not out of insecurity or guilt or obligation, but it's because we are in agreement with who God says we are. Jesus served with a purpose, that we might know that we have purpose. We have purpose. We don't have a purpose, we have purpose. Okay? And our purpose is that we would serve and love others just like the example that we were giving. That is our purpose. That's why we're here. So I want to go back to verse 4 again just for a moment. In verse 4, John wrote, so he, that's Jesus, got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Now that word took off means kind of to lay aside or put down, and it's a beautiful description of Christ's humility. It's a beautiful description of why Jesus stepped out of heaven and into our world. But what's going on here is much, much, much bigger than washing feet. It's a demonstration. Again, Jesus comes down. He takes off or lays aside something that is in the way of him serving. This is a reminder for us of what Paul wrote to the church at Philippi about Jesus. This is Philippians 2. Paul wrote, this is about Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul's describing the ultimate example of humility and servanthood. Jesus was the second person of the Trinity, right? Yet he stepped out of heaven and took off what was due him, his majesty and his glory and his divinity, right? He kept his divinity, but he didn't show it, okay? So all the rights and privileges of being God, the Son of God. And he took it off and took on the nature of a servant because that's his purpose. That was why he came. He wasn't kind of a servant sometimes. No, his servanthood was who he was. It wasn't something he did. It was who he was, even to the cross. Verse 12. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. Now, I love that question because it always reminds me of that commercial, right? What are you wearing, Jake from State Farm? Khakis, right? That you can imagine this picture, right? Jesus has just gotten finished washing the feet of his disciples. It was pretty obvious what he was doing. And yet he asked this question, do you know what I was doing? And you know, Peter wanted to jump up and say, wash their feet. You were washing our feet, Jesus. That's the answer. That's what you did, right? And so the question for us is the same. Do we understand what Jesus was doing? It was more than washing feet. Do we understand the example he set for us? Jesus was demonstrating, he was declaring, right, that God is not insecure, God is not a people pleaser, God is not arrogant, he's not needy, he's not controlling, he's not manipulative. Remember, Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? So if you see Jesus doing something, you've seen what the Father would do. And Jesus is demonstrating that here. He's demonstrating, no, God is not any of those things. He is love. And you need to know that because Jesus came to serve you and to serve me out of love, to fulfill his purpose and his identity, not out of obligation. He could have stayed right where he was, but he came to serve. He's serving those he loves in this story. When he's washing the disciples' feet, these are his guys, people that he has been with for 3 years. So he loves them. And he's serving those he loves. But he's also serving Judas, right? Who's one of his disciples, who in a few short hours is going to betray him. I mean, you can picture the scene. Jesus is kind of going down the line, washing feet. And he comes to Judas, and he gets down, probably on his knees. He takes Judas's sandals off, and he puts his dirty feet in this bowl, and he pours water over them, and he begins to wash them, right? And he's thinking about the man that he has known for the last 3 years and that he loves, and he knows is going to betray him. In just a few short hours, this is going to happen. How? I mean, how could Jesus do that, knowing the pain, knowing what awaited him at the cross? How could he do that? Because he knew who he was. He knew his identity. He knew his purpose. And he knew this about Judas. Even Judas was created in God's image. And so he's worthy of being served. That's how Jesus could do that. Verse 15. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Do you want to find your identity? Do you want to find your purpose? Did Jesus say, hey, remember what I did and think good thoughts about it, and that'll help you? I mean, did he say, hey, take a spiritual gift test and see if serving's one of your gifts, and if it is, then you probably should serve? No, that's not what he said. He said, I've set you an example. Now go and do likewise. Go and do what I did. I just demonstrated it for you. Now you should go do that as well. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, not because you owe somebody or somebody owes you, but because it's who you are. It's who you were created to be, that you were created to serve. It's your identity. It's our purpose. If you're a follower of Jesus, that's who you are. That's who God says you are. Do as Jesus did, and you will find your purpose, right? The same invitation is still there for us. Will you embrace your identity? Will you agree with who God says you are? Because at the end of the day, that's the only opinion that really matters. It's not your neighbors, it's not your family, it's not your friends, it's not the people you work with. It's who God says you are. Embrace your purpose and move into humility. And then you can be set free to serve. You see how freeing that is when you serve, not because of guilt or because you owe anything, but because it's your purpose. It's who you are. You're living out who you are when you serve. It can be so free if you embrace that.